Welcome to Kerbal Space Program 2, and in today's video we're gonna build and then fly the iconic Ranger and Endurance spacecraft from the movie Interstellar. Since it was released in 2014, so 9 years ago, I hope most, if not all of you, have already seen it at least once and have an idea what it is that we're building here. At this point, I want to thank all of you so much for the positive feedback I've received ever since I uploaded my first KSP2 video on March 1st. It has been a pleasure reading your comments and exchanging words with you. The Ranger, as this is the very first vehicle on screen, has been a major challenge. I mean, it's not like Endurance was easy, but the shape of the Ranger craft is unique to say the least and really hard to recreate in KSP. This one isn't perfect, I'm not saying it is. I had to take some artistic liberties to make it even happen. I started with the new rover cap / cockpit as it resembles the windows the best, and then made a general shape of the ship out of Mark II tanks. The forward section was the most troubling part since we do not have correctly scaled parts, and that's a yet I hope, so I went with that big recessed front design. I thought, hey, some navigation lamps might look cool. I generally used different size structural panels to mimic the body shape as best as I could, and this is really the best I was able to come up with. What you see here is the final version that's gonna go to space, and cut out were different approaches, none of which I liked enough. The panels, especially when placed at an angle, are near impossible to put straight unless you really tweak their placement, and the rotation of the part sometimes glitches out, resulting in constant spin. Also, often when you want to attach anything to the panel, just drag something through it, it tends to glitch to whatever default position. That indeed presents a great challenge, especially when creating something as complicated and seemingly impossible to build, given the state of the game. Both builds are also done on the day 1 patch, so none of the March 16th update changes were even a thing when both craft were born. I think it literally took me almost 4 hours just building the Ranger shuttle, and something like 2.5 hours was spent working on Endurance, and that was spread throughout near 4 days of work connected to this whole project. I'd say the Interstellar ship's recreation is like the ultimate boss of shipbuilding in KSP, again because of shape and how complicated they are. When KSP2 gets auto struts sorted out and there shall be no need for dozens of struts, I think we may revisit the Endurance program and see if it would go anywhere but hell without strutting almost everything together. When I think about it, I should have put my FPS counter into the video capture so that you could get the real picture of how struts train performance out of the game. That still is bad FPS wise without so many parts in physics range. Honestly, I'm still baffled how in the universe my Ranger didn't fall apart on the first test and instead kinda ate my landing gear and sat on its undercarriage, but to me that was the most glorious moment of this whole adventure. And speaking of adventures, I've tried to get you guys a nice weekly challenge and even landed a garage on Minmus to do so. However, Kraken, the hellspawn bastard, decided against my success, and just because of that I've lost nearly 5 days of work and 100 GB of footage because I was simply unable to complete the mission. Either the rover kept losing wheels, rover parts would sort of melt stuck together, or the whole thing would get obliterated for no apparent reason. This time I said to myself, I'm gonna win. To do so, I went with even more complex craft instead of a rocket carrot, basically. Now I know that Minmus, cause that's where we're going today, may seem like a boring place to visit, and I agree to an extent, but after encountering several glitches that you're gonna see later in the video, cause I decided to leave it in, I was glad my Eeloo plans didn't work out when I was still in low Kerbin orbit. I've picked Eeloo as my first go-to place somewhat worthy of a craft like this. I calculated the delta V, it would have been thin and very close, but possible, and then tested my Ranger landing and ascent from Eeloo, and it worked flawlessly. What happened was that I was unable to perform my Kerbin escape burn because the ship wouldn't maintain its course and instead would spin out for no reason, even when countered by 12 RS-25 replica engines that have a ginormous gimbal wrench, RCS and reaction wheels. I tried several times, none of which yielded any other results. Finally I settled for Minmus, and boy, it was the hardest Minmus mission to do in my life and the hardest one I've seen ever. Don't get me wrong, thrust to weight ratio is actually really good, it's just that the turning and spin are super slow and I couldn't use full engine's power on endurance as it would wobble itself to death. I would say it was actually easier to do the garage mission that I couldn't post because it was glitchy as heck. And on that note, we can skip ahead to endurance build. I didn't want to go with panels again at the beginning, but realized there's no other parts that are square enough to get the look of the ring compartments right. I can't even speak. In this case, every single box will contain fuel tanks, and 4 of those kinda angled ones are fuel tanks with engine mounts, 3 nozzles on each plate. Ranger is attached to the ring via round tubes connected with docking ports just to look like it did in the movie. It's worth mentioning I needed to kind of Kerbalize this whole thing by added weird looking landing legs in the back or wheels. First, I went for the original landing legs idea that go to the side, but the biggest legs are too big, and the ones just a bit smaller than that aren't strong enough to support the weight. I've also added nav lights up front and blue lights in the back to resemble the engines from the movie. Enough about the Ranger for now though. All these tubes and boxes that form the iconic endurance look were insanely hard to build. Therefore, I came up with a way to do it by mostly connecting tubes to hubs and not ready hubs plus tubes to the plates. You see me now experimenting with different ways of closing it up so that it looks legit. I'm finally gonna settle for another solution, much simpler and elegant. More challenges were introduced to me when I found out that you can't in this case use symmetry for near anything regarding the ring structure, so I decided to work smarter and not harder enough, just did good old copy and paste, at the same time trying hard not to drag the copied part through anything as it would just glitch itself randomly placed pieces. Of course, every single one of these modules had to be strutted together from the inside, which presents another problem, that is game performance, meaning more struts equals more loss. I think max frame rate I got during the entire mission, was 10 FPS. It is probably still a higher frame rate than what I would have had prior to patch 1. To be clear, I don't expect 144 frames per second when KSP2 is fully patched. I just want something around, 30 to 40 FPS. Since we got all that out of the way and you feel bad for me, which you shouldn't obviously, because I'm here by choice, we can shift our focus to the actual ring taking final shape, and at this point I was really happy but started suspecting it's just gonna be too big, and spoiler alert, my hunch was right. At first these truss tubes and hubs offset by 1 notch seemed to do the job, but pretty quickly after I decided to copy the modules, a realization came to my mind and I right off the bat knew how difficult it will be to set it all straight. Before you know is my fight with parts that hold minds of their own and would love to screw with me ever so slightly, never to full extent though. I'd say it was still easier to build endurance than it was to build the Ranger. When I was almost done, however, I thought of building the lander as well, but given how bad the game ran with these 2 ships together, I didn't want to risk it nor spend another 2 days on something that will most likely not work, and since I was able to incorporate the lander into the shuttle, the need for another vehicle was gone. I mainly thought about the lander because someone pointed out to me that there actually was a lander present in the movie, and I somehow didn't remember that. Thank you to that person, and if the game allows, we might build one when we get to revisit this project in the future. Lander's design should be a bit on the easy side of things if we go for structural panels again, as it was mostly squared from what I remember. I might put one on screen for you. Now you can also see how big the ring would have been if I didn't make it smaller to make it look more like in the movie. And as for what's going on screen, I know the top module or box is misplaced and should be raised to the correct position, but worry not, it has been fixed later on, when I was strutting stuff together off camera, as I felt it would be very boring watching a man connect pieces with lines, and now you can actually see the top module. I'm a professional, you know. And speaking of boxes, I went for general looks again. I'd normally just place some science modules or radiator panels on the outside to better resemble the original. Right now, however, we have exactly zero science in the game, so I had to deal without these features. Now has come the time when nearly everything is ready and we can prepare to launch it to space. But not this time, as this time we're gonna meet in orbit. I admit I had to cheat it into a low Kerbin orbit to even be able to use the ships at all. It's not stable enough to be put on a rocket, and it cannot be stable enough without autostruts. Sure, there was an option to build it in orbit, but given how bad the docking ports currently are, I didn't want to go completely insane trying to do that for another day and ultimately fail. Instead, I'm able to bring you guys a fully working space-capable Endurance from Interstellar. The entire ring requires some minor or major tweaking, playing around with modules positions, shortening thrust tubes, and frankly adjusting all the bits and pieces so that we end up with a somewhat stable spacecraft in the end. Special attention was needed regarding mass distribution and the thrust vector overall, meaning I had to lower thrust of Ranger engines to 0% and then look at the vector of thrust, as these engines weren't designed to burn alongside the outer 12. Ranger incorporates two Terrier engines that proved being too weak, especially for landing burns, and were exchanged to swivel engines, mainly for their power and gimbals. And finally, welcome to space! We are in stable orbit around Kerbin, getting ready to plan the maneuver that will get us into Minmus sphere of influence. Let me know down in the comments whether it's just me or are notes in general super inaccurate and just weird as compared to the first KSP. I was able to easily get a Minmus encounter, which is nothing to brag about, but the orbit indicators were inaccurate, and so was the burn timer in the middle of the screen. Also, take notice of how slow the ship actually turns or spins. That footage was played at 7 times the speed. I think the whole 360 loop takes around 10 precious minutes, and it has to be done in real time since there's no physical time warp in the game. Finally though, we were able to perform our escape burn without any issues really. It wasn't a massive burn, but a substantial one for sure, especially if you're trying to limit the thrust on your engine so that you don't lose your ship. If I understand lines in this game correctly, this is a free return trajectory. Nice, but for now a useless addition to our specific flight plan. Honestly, I can't even express how bad it feels to have the orbital lines in the game now, but they don't really work, and sadly the ones that would have popped out from time to time before the patch were way more useful. As I'm babbling right now, we're on the Minmus approach pretty much, quickly moving towards our newest problem. The game decided it would be a good idea to pop me out around the mint ball heading clockwise, which is certainly a major problem, as we want to capture and leave with the moon's rotation to get a bit of the free delta V, and since the rotation in 90% of cases is counterclockwise, I was aiming for that in this case too. Given that, I needed to repeat my capture burn, and my good comrade the F9 key was there to help. I only suspect the cause of this happening is that we popped behind Minmus and we were dragged back into its sphere. We would need to perform a capture burn followed by a correction burn, but since the gravity well is very shallow and we still have some distance, the fuel expenditure was actually pretty low. You see me there play with the perigee altitude and inclination, making sure we will be going low and pretty much along the equator for easier docking and escape. At last we got our capture around Minmus complete for relatively cheap, as the delta V needed was something like 260 meters per second. Inclination change was required just to make it easier for us. Honestly, I've never had so many problems adjusting my orbit as I did that time, and it still remains a mystery as to why that was. Another maneuver has been plotted to bring us into our desired orbit, and we can time warp ahead, viewing our destination closing in on us, seemingly. After a series of different rolls and turns and burns, we got our circle established in the end. However, before that becomes reality, ahead of us is a fight with our SAS capabilities. They are pretty much very low, as reaction wheels are really underpowered in KSP2. After we're done, you're gonna see first major glitches of this video. Let me remind you that even though the spacecraft were built prior to March 16th patch, the flight had taken place on the patch day, so everything you see is relevant up until another game update. Now, I'm not really sure as to why I decided to include all that orbit adjusting footage, but it may give you an idea how difficult it was and how easy it seems when cut and played at 7 times the speed. We got a nice circle around Minmus and we can finally pan around our ship and prepare to undock the Ranger from the Endurance craft. Let me just say, it looks absolutely stunning out there, like the Minmus surface in the background and our ship just there effortlessly orbiting. After undocking, I realized I was supposed to refuel the Ranger as the main engines drained fuel from our shuttle tanks, even with crossfit disabled on all connections. That's 2 docking ports and a stack separator. I had to reload a quick save and was struck with a spaghetti spaceship. I kept on reloading the save until I got to the point where everything seemed fine, and actually fine it was. Then I began tedious process of fuel transfer, and later you're going to notice I needed to get back to my resource manager to transfer some more of the monopropellant into our lander craft in case we're gonna need to make small adjustments somewhere along the way, either down or back up. When the refueling has finally been completed, I then proceeded to undock our Ranger again and was really hopeful it's gonna go smooth like the last time when I forgot the fuel. I could have made the landing even on half of the tanks, but something told me it's better to take more than get stranded. That is a bit of a spoiler of what's to come sooner than you think. At first I just decoupled the stack separator, but the 2 docking ports on each side attracted each other and rejoined the 2 ships together, and then made any undocking impossible as the option was gone, with craft being still attached to one another. I needed to reload a quick save again and come up with another way. Turns out that if I undocked the top piece above our initial port, we were able to break free at the same time, introducing yet another glitch, well known from the first days of KSP Tour early access, the camera glitch, another ditched element stuck to like a common point in space. I didn't know that yet, however, and proceeded to plot a orbit burn aiming for the Minmus flats, oblivious to what comes next. At the same time, our Endurance there that was left in orbit suffered some kind of malfunction and was on a collision course with Minmus. That is indeed strange, because no RCS or main engines were enabled, but instead the SAS wheels or some unnoticed spin introduced a significant orbit change of a ship that was supposed to be inert. I had to quickly perform a prograde burn to stay in orbit. I've decided to let you guys see the footage of my failed landing attempts, as I don't want to present this game as a perfect product, which it of course isn't. But if kept on the right track, KSP2 is bound for greatness. Someday. As you see, the camera sticks to a point in space between the 2 objects and the ship sort of runs away, then spins out uncontrollably, and there is no way to regain said control. At least I was able to take some screenshots along the way, so the time wasn't completely wasted. With that being said, we can head back, with the help of the F9 key of course, to Minmus orbit where the 2 craft await us, and luckily for us we were able to undock without much trouble, but I had to reload the save multiple times and even restart the game more than once. We can spin the Ranger towards the retrograde vector and switch controls to the main cap. Now the maneuvers are way quicker with all that mass ditched in orbit, and honestly it's like a breath of fresh air after hours of struggle. Our deorbit burn came easy enough, and we are headed for the minty ground pretty quickly. I am certainly amazed by how nice the graphics are. It almost really feels like I'm about to land somewhere else in space. I got some no-HUD shots for you as well, but I'm kinda bummed that the devs decided it's a good idea to keep the time warp bar always visible. It ruins my shots a bit, sadly. In the meantime, the landing burn has commenced, and I needed to balance the thrust and our weight distribution to be able to keep the ship on the retrograde vector, as using full power resulted in overcompensation. With a bit of thinking though, the landing kept on going as planned, and we were soon bound to land on the minty looking ground. The landing legs have been deployed, and we began sorta walking our ship to a standstill, and our brave Kerbals on board brace for imminent impact, or at the very least landing. Engines correction and touchdown of the Ranger on minty flats of Minmus, signifying that a major milestone of the mission has been completed. We needed some SAS counterbalance to keep us pointed upwards, but it all went right. After a quick checkup, I noticed we won't be able to plant a flag because the hatch on this crew cabin is on the starboard side and is blocked by body panels. My thinking process was that I'll be able to get out through the docking port extension I made, but I decided to wing it instead of testing, and here are the effects. Nothing left to do but launch back into space, keeping our main ship Endurance in relative sight and maintaining the 90 degrees heading. We can perform the orbital insertion burn, which I ultimately overshot and needed to burn radial out because we were past the perigee. After reaching orbit, I made a decision not to bother with rendezvous too much, and I just used the good old way of burning towards target, then retrograde relative to the target, then target being our endurance ring craft, and then to target again, and so on. As we neared our ship, I kept on using smaller and smaller speed adjustments so that we wouldn't ram ships together and cause a crash. I just went little by little, still not really trusting KSP2, and for that reason I was hesitant to use any sort of time warp, but I ended up time warping anyway from time to time. We were then brought into the vicinity of the main ship, and we needed a strategy to get the two to dock together. Docking turned out to be probably the biggest challenge yet. First though, we needed to switch our controls to the aft docking port and select Endurance docking port as a target, so that we could maintain automatically the alignment, and we needed to do the same from the other side. When I wanted to time warp even a tiny bit, just to get it to touch quicker, Endurance would just explode without any sort of explanation. I then retried my docking approach and the very same thing happened, plus Endurance wouldn't stop spinning, kinda reminding the epic Interstellar scene where Ranger docks mid-spin. However, there was no way I could do it here. I then said, okay, the Kraken may have won this battle, but I'm gonna win the war. I then went for possibly the most obnoxious way of returning to Kerbin by simply dragging the prograde node far enough to get to Kerbin orbit. We can now perform our escape burn and get ourselves on course home. We obviously needed to lower our periapsis significantly so that it would dip us into the atmosphere, resulting in aero braking, and since there is no re-entry heating in the game yet, we could just land by entering Kerbin at orbital speeds and be absolutely fine. Now, the upcoming time warp will bring us back to our home planet, where we will finally be able to land and at last relax after this long and bumpy journey. There's just some aero braking and losing control of the ship ahead. The ship actually re-enters somewhat fine, there's just no way of keeping facing forward and we are forced to go down aft first, which proves to be the preferred way apparently, because we can land on our landing legs even though I wanted to land like a plane. Just because it's Kerbal space program, I last minute decided to attach 6 parachutes to the vehicle just in case we were out of fuel, which would have been the case if we decided to go to Eeloo. Since we're left with half a tank of fuel, we can easily land this craft fully powered, and we don't even have to perform a suicide burn this time around as the Delta V is huge. We're gently maintaining our velocity accordingly to altitude, slowly nearing ground beneath. I wanted to touch down as gently as possible, hence the series of different burns keeping us from hitting the ground too hard. And now that we landed safely, I can thank you for watching and tell you to either like or dislike and maybe subscribe for more, and see you in the very next video while we're driving off into the distance.